Well, John, I am really glad to have you here because when I visited Horizon Hobby a few weeks ago, I was told that like you were involved with so many of the things that people who are new to the RC hobby just take for granted. And you, in fact, apparently have your name on some important patents. And I thought
Huh,
I wanted to start this interview with a little bit of an introduction of yourself and who
sure.
you are, and let's segue that into a discussion of some of the things you've contributed to RC that some of the kids these days maybe don't even know about and how things used to be.
Sure. Absolutely. Happy to tell you. So my name is John Adams. I am the director of technology here at Horizon. I've been at Horizon for just over 30 years, so a very, very long time. A lifelong modeler. Literally started like slot car racing when I was like 3 years old. My grandparents took me to the local hobby shop and, raced almost every weekend, 124 scale slot cars. And, that basically started a lifelong hobby, a lifelong lifestyle for me. So have absolutely been crazy about RC. Always very mechanical. Studied technical school mechanical and also mechanical engineering. So that's kind of what got me started. Horizon got going in 1986, and actually I knew the founders of Horizon before Horizon got going, and they were aware of my intense level of interest in all phases of radio control. I was a competitive car racer, did airplanes and helicopters, and so it was kind of a natural. Those guys, the original founders, said, "Hey, John, we'd love to have you come to work for Horizon. We only have about 10 or 12 people here now. We hope to be able to grow. Will you join us as the director of research and development?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't know. It seems like a pretty risky thing." And lo and behold, historically we just grew like nobody's business, and here we are today. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the short story. Um,
Yeah, and you've been doing this for 30 years, and there might be some people today in the FPV community who'd be a little bit surprised to hear that RC's been around for 30 years, especially
yeah,
RC flight. But of course, it has been. What was RC flight like, 30, 25 years ago, and how is it
yeah.
different than it is today?
So I've actually first started, got started doing this probably in the middle to late 70s. And of course, radio systems. Back then, of course, we didn't have really any electric aircraft. We had subseas, nickel metal hydride, or I'm sorry, NICADs at that time. The performance level just wouldn't get the job done. We only had brushed motors. Electric was pretty much inconceivable that you could fly a helicopter or an airplane, or much less a helicopter. In addition, the radio systems, and I spent an awful lot of time working on radio systems. We had narrow band systems that were on a single frequency, and in the early days there were only six frequencies. And so keep in mind, only one person could be on a frequency at a time. So if two people were on at the frequency at the same time, bad hair day for both. So and the reliability, we were on 72 megahertz, 53 megahertz in some cases, and the reliability of the equipment was pretty poor. On 72 megahertz, the model itself would actually create interference that would interfere with the receiver, with the radio. So literally, you could take a screwdriver across the head of an engine, and you could see the servos jump up and down when you would. It was seriously that was the way it worked.
Yeah.
And so you were very fortunate to go to the flying field, get in several flights, and come home with your airplane in one piece, primarily due to the fact that the reliability of the radio or somebody didn't turn on your frequency and so on. And of course, I've been involved in competition since a long time. I mean, literally 35 years or so. And so when we would go to various competitions, car races and so on, you would have transmitter impounds. So you would go to the event, you would turn your transmitter in, it would be registered on a particular frequency. And then when it was time for you to do your thing, they would call you, you would come get your transmitter, you could have it, and you'd be able to turn on for a short period of time. You'd have to turn them all off. They would all have to be checked in, and the next group would go. I remember going to IRCHA in those early days of IRCHA, and back then, we were even having like 300 and 400 people. Now it got to a point where it was about over 1,000. This year was a little less than that. But, literally, they had numerous people in the transmitter impounds. You'd have to turn your transmitter in, and I would give them a tag, and there were times when I would wait 4 and 5 hours just to be able to go out and fly one flight on my helicopter. So obviously, spread spectrum technology has really, really changed that. And I don't know if you and your viewers realize this, but Spektrum pioneered this technology.
Talk about the transition from analog to spread spectrum, and let's give credit where credit's due. You might be a little reticent to toot your own horn, but Spektrum as a company and Horizon Hobby have a lot to do with that transition, don't they? That didn't just happen out of the blue.
Absolutely. So actually in the middle 90s, myself and a few people here at Horizon, we came to the conclusion that, hey, the military is doing some pretty trick stuff, that essentially you could have multiple people working using the same channels simultaneously and not have interference. So in the 90s, we started researching and working with various folks on how to do spread spectrum for the radio control industry.
A lot has changed since then, because spread spectrum started as a military secret, but it's a way of encoding digital signals such that originally it was kind of used as encryption, I think, because analog signals are real easy to pick up on. But today it's used in Wi-Fi, it's used in cordless phones, it's used all over the place. And I think it's easy to take for granted the things we get when we use spread spectrum for RC control, just see it as inevitable that it would have happened. But it sounds like it wasn't inevitable. What was that transition like? What was involved in that? It was really
difficult, in those early days to get it going. So then we as Horizon, and I personally contacted several RF engineering houses, and we worked through various folks. And we spent a lot of money and a lot of time, and we had, some successes and some failures and so on. We had some pretty dramatic failures. Finally, we got a hold of a guy, or we heard about a guy, and his name was Paul Beard. And so he is a kind of a genius in spread spectrum. He owns several companies, and Cypress Semiconductor, he sold his company to Cypress Semiconductor, and he was actually involved with that company. They were designing chips specifically for spread spectrum technology as utilized in wireless networks and also for mice and stuff. And he happened to be a radio control enthusiast as well, which was tremendously beneficial. So we found out about this guy, we got hooked up with him, and got started. And in 2004, we introduced the first ever spread spectrum system for radio control. It was for surface only. It was modules. It was a low power system, so you really couldn't use it for full range aircraft. But we actually introduced it at the 2004 IFMAR World Championships, and there were I took about 25 systems down in Florida. And when we ran them there, and that was the first time in public that it was ever used. So
it must have just blown people's mind to see 25 planes in the air at once, or cars.
In this case, exactly, it totally was. And so it was really cool because they still made people impound their transmitters. However, the beautiful thing is you no longer have radio interference. So the cars would cause radio interference that would cause themselves, or other people would, or literally a CB guy would go by in his semi, and he could key the mic and it would cause interference. So these 25 guys had a tremendous advantage at the IFMAR World Championships. Actually, a guy by the name of Bob Novak was in charge of running the race, and he was good enough, since we had FCC approval, to allow us to use it. And it was pretty cool. And from that point on, it grew like nobody's business.
I don't think there's a better example of the advantage of spread spectrum than if you go to an event like Flight Fest and they have their airplane combat, where there will be 150 planes in the air at once, all trying to smash into each other, and everybody's just having a great time. Nobody thinks twice about putting up. Just walk up to the line, take a station, fly. Were you directly involved with the development of the technology?
Yeah, absolutely. So Paul Beard had the background and the technical information to implement it, and of course I have been tremendously involved in the hobby industry. So he and I worked together. We also had there's a patent for spread spectrum technology in the radio control arena. And there are 4 folks that are on the patent, which include Paul Beard, myself, a gentleman by the name of Eric Myers, who's primarily a marketing person, and then Matt Lee was basically an engineer that did some hardware design for us. So 4 people are actually on that original patent. The neat thing about it is when we released this in 2004, and then we had the full range system, I think it was in 2006, we had about a 2-year lead on everybody else. So for about 2 years, it was pretty difficult for our competitors to sell anything else, as you can imagine.
Yeah, why would you want an analog radio?
Totally.
No one
So,
would want
our
that.
competitors were kind of stumped. And also, they were somewhat in denial, saying, this will never go, the 2.4 gigahertz is just not the right way, blah, blah, blah. And so so keep in mind, before 2004, the Spektrum brand didn't even exist. So we gained probably 90% market share in 2006 and 2007 in all the categories, airplanes, helicopters,
Sure.
boats, and so on. So it just absolutely took over the world. It was a really, really neat time.
I gotta ask because there's some people who feel like Spektrum has a reputation for not having as good link reliability and range,
Yeah,
and what do you think's up with that? You guys invented this technology. There's no doubt
yeah.
that the digital spread spectrum is superior to analog. Where do you think that comes from?
So the DSM-2, our first generation, actually, DSM was the first generation, second generation. So unquestionably, the third generation is definitely far superior. So when we do a protocol, we have the ability to manipulate the protocol to give us various advantages. So, for example, you can, but there's always trade-offs. So, for example, latency. When you said, so I think you're referring to Tyrannus. I believe you're somewhat of a Tyrannus user or supporter.
That's primarily what I use these days. It is
Yeah.
true. It is true.
And so we do, and so I personally do. In fact, I was looking at a test report we did recently. I personally do an awful lot of testing, even today, range testing, RF link performance testing, and so on. That includes latency testing. We test all of our competitors. So our system is optimized for low latency, and it's optimized for transmission in the typical radio control hobby, which is primarily, for us, was airplanes and RC cars and helicopters and so on. So in the cases that we have, we really push low latency, which has to do with data rates and power output and so on. You'll find that the Tyrannus system is optimized for range, but it has a very, very high latency. Latency is time. You give a stick input, and so I can show you the latency numbers. We do them here, and then we also send them out to outside labs. So what I can also tell you is that we're working on next generation stuff, and so until the quadcopters came along, and really the quadcopters, the guys that fly freestyle and fly behind buildings and so on. So what we find is we are at parity with most of our competitors. The Tyrannus unit is optimized more for range and penetration and not for latency. And so what we've done now in all of our new radio systems, when I say all, I'm not sure that it's quite accurate, but certainly on several of our new radio systems, if folks are looking for long range, they're now compatible with TBS Crossfire. So, 900 megahertz. Inherently, 2.4 gigahertz is a very, very high frequency, and it doesn't penetrate well through solid objects, especially metallic objects. That's just inherently how it works. So for applications where you need long range, or you're flying behind buildings or in buildings and trees and so on, that's where the TBS Crossfire thing works. So right now we have the best of both worlds, we believe, and that is our 2.4 gigahertz system is equal to the fastest on the market. In many cases, it's the fastest, and we have the documents to prove that, both internally, and we've had outside sources that verify that. And if you want the long range stuff, and you're probably very familiar with TBS Crossfire, you can that into the back of our transmitter and go. So
so it's like, once the meme gets out there, then especially if you got people who are haters, they're going to repeat it whether the facts are there. But you see these guys flying these $10,000 planes on Spektrum, and they certainly wouldn't do it if it wasn't a reliable system. It is very interesting.
$10,000 is low. I mean, we have an event this weekend. We've got several guys here with $25,000 airplanes. And the jets are about 80% market share flying Spektrum, maybe even 85%. So go right ahead.
That's an interesting perspective, though. I'll tell you, whenever I've heard that, I've often wondered, are you actually flying on a Spektrum receiver, or are you flying on an Orange or a Lemon receiver, which, for anyone who doesn't know, are Chinese brands that are compatible. And I think if you say Spektrum failsafe and you're flying on an Orange receiver, you can't really put that on Spektrum. Let's talk about Crossfire then, because I have been really, when I first heard about Crossfire, I said, oh, well, isn't that interesting? Some long range stuff. And I've been really shocked at how popular it's gotten, even among people who just do normal freestyle flying. I wonder what did you think when you first heard of Crossfire? And what do you think now that you've seen how it's developed?
Oh yeah, so absolutely, 900 megahertz, much lower frequency. So that has many advantages. It obviously gives you greater range for the same power output. The And also the ability to penetrate through concrete, metal, and so on. I mean, it's tremendous in that respect. It works extremely well. And I mean, that's obviously why we had adopted it and allow it to be used with it's compatible now with our newest radios. Plus, there are other folks out there that offer add-on modules that are compatible with our new radios. So absolutely, recommend it highly for the appropriate application. We're working on some kind of special things that are somewhat confidential too, that maybe we can have some dual functionality with 900 versus 2.4 and so on. We're in the early stages of that, but some redundant systems as well. So, but yeah, no, Crossfire stuff works great. We have hundreds of customers utilizing it. Absolutely would recommend that. It's appropriate for specific use, undoubtedly.
So there's one topic that I definitely want to make sure we hit before we close, and that is digital and analog video. I think that's a real pain point for people, and I want to hear your perspective on it. Having made the transition from analog to digital control, but before we do that, you got any new products lined up that you want to show us? Anything you're excited about that you want to get in? Because I appreciate your time. I want to give you the chance to show off anything that it's not just all about what I want to talk about. What do you got?
Sure. Okay, yeah, so several things. Of course, several months ago, we released the iX12. And of course, I have one right here. So this has been a tremendous hit. We talk about some of the innovations that Spektrum has brought to the industry. Well, this is the first ever, smart device that's fully connected. So it's connected to Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And it has the most sophisticated audio system of any radio, period. A couple things that we are about to release, and that is
preview.
Yeah,
exciting.
People are calling these antenna-less receivers, but actually there is an antenna, but it's internal. So there is a technology. It's a wiggle antenna that was actually designed by Texas Instruments. So it makes for installation being very easy. This happens to be a 6-channel aircraft receiver. The end pins are here, kind of a unique shape if you can see it. Has a bind button here, so we're going towards bind buttons. People are finding that a little more convenient than some of the bind plugs. And we have a 4-channel version as well. And we also have a Surface version. So this is called the Surface version's been available for probably 2 months or so. So this is a 3-channel race Surface version that's optimized for the lowest possible latency and easy installation. The thing that I'd like to talk about, and that is Spektrum has pioneered several technologies. We already talked about spread spectrum, the iX12. One of the other things that we're really proud of and has been tremendously successful for us, and that has been Safe and Safe Plus and Safe Select. So we've taught tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of pilots to fly using Safe. And for those of you that aren't aware of what Safe's about, in fact, last week we hired a new vice president of marketing. He had no experience with flying radio control models. I took him out to the flying field on the very first flight. He took off, he flew around, and he landed successfully on the runway. Safe makes it so easy to fly. Basically, it limits the envelope, so if you can't over control it. When you release the stick, everything returns to straight and level.
Here's the last thing I want to talk about, which is we talked at the beginning of this interview about the transition from analog control to digital control, and spread spectrum was this kind of a magic bullet that we don't even think about interference or stomping on signal anymore. And we are the pilots of today who fly FPV are experiencing that still with analog video, where we have the exact same problem. Somebody powers on, we should impound your video transmitter, but nobody's thought of that yet as far as I know. And people always say to me, we could put a man on the moon, but we can't solve the problem of analog video. And I say, it's not that simple. And I thought there's no one better in the world to tell us why it's not that simple than you. Or is it that simple? And Horizon Hobby or Spektrum has a new product coming out next week to solve it all.
Well, I'll tell you what is difficult. It's something we've talked about here a lot. And so me personally, I got involved in quad racing, primarily locally. I was traveling probably within 200 miles to some of the races around here. and it was quite disturbing. I would you'd take off and everything's happy, and then the next time you'd take off and you would lose signal. You'd never even get to the first turn. So really, the answer is that the video feed uses up so much bandwidth. So there's so much information that's constantly being streamed 100% of the time. So what most people don't realize is with these transmitters, they have a duty cycle, and like our duty cycle is about, when we think about this, it's about 10%. So the transmitter's only on 10% of the time, it's off 90% of the time. However, that happens, depending upon the transmitter, like 450 times a second. Mm-hmm. With video, it uses a much larger bandwidth. So, we use 1 megahertz. It takes a huge amount of bandwidth, and it's on 100% of the time. So imagine this: you only have a small number of channels available. With spread spectrum 2.4 gigahertz, most manufacturers, including us, split the band up so that we have 80 channels, and we only spend a very small percentage of the time on each one of those channels. With video, the bandwidth is so large. There's only how many channels are there? Like a Fat Shark, so.
Yeah, Raceband is probably the best example. There's 8 channels, and they have I think it's about 40 to 60 megahertz separate. I have to pull up a chart, but
and I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but that's just the point: is you have a very few number of channels available. So if you have a hopping scheme, there's only a few. You're gonna have collisions inherently, and they're going to be on pretty much the whole time. So technically, it's a real challenge. The digital video, and I'm sure you've played with some of this. Mm-hmm. So the images are really great. Most of the systems sacrifice as you start to go out of range. Then the latency is reduced, and it makes it a little tough. If you're very far out, you get so much latency. It's very difficult to.
And I don't mind if you get a little technical here. Feel free. My audience are all nerds, and if they're not nerds, they'll nod along and pretend they understand, or they'll tune out. But screw them. Sorry, audience. I don't mind. I want to. Because I think there are some fundamental technological and sort of physical constraints. People say, well, just why can't we can make digital video? Just do it. Why can't we make digital video? Like Connex ProSight is a company you may be familiar with. They have what I think is they got the closest to cracking this nut, but their sales numbers show that they just didn't quite get there. Why is it so hard? Like for example, high definition digital videos. Okay, screw high definition. Just give me a standard definition. Give me a 640 by 480 digital feed. I just don't want to have to think about channels anymore. Why can't we do that?
And so it's around the corner. Technically, it is very challenging, primarily because it does use up so much bandwidth. That's really the fundamental issue that occurs here.
What about latency? Because I've heard that the encoding scheme, the compression scheme, inherently adds latency that you just can't get around that. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And so, but keep in mind the way that the most digital systems are currently in operation is when you're at close range and the data rate's high and the latency is acceptable, but as you get farther away, rather than having buffering, they actually slow down the data rate, which increases the latency, and then it becomes somewhat unflyable at range. Right. Flyable, at least from a perspective of being able to race. So there are things, we've experimented with a lot of things. We've been working with a lot of different companies. Generally, we are not trying to crack the nut personally in-house with digital video, because there's an awful lot of people that are in the process of doing that, and that's not our particular area of expertise. However, we hope to partner with somebody that's on top of it. And we have been in contact with several manufacturers that are working on it. I haven't seen anything that's acceptable from a price perspective.
There you go.
And even at the high end stuff, the thing is, for probably about $1,500, you can do it, but it doesn't work in our hobby. We just can't sell that many. So, but the price is coming down. We're working with some people overseas. Really can't tell you who it is, but there are some folks that samples from time to time, and they're constantly working on it. And we identified probably a year and a half ago exactly what you're saying. Whoever does this is going to be the king of the FPV video, or FPV for that matter. But it's just not, it's not doable at this point at a cost factor.
There you go.
That usable for, yeah, I mean, that's the reality.
The reality is, I mean, it is a solvable problem, but the FPV is so uniquely hard because we need something that is low latency, decent video quality. It has to be light because we can't put it on a quad or an airplane if it weighs 2 pounds, and and it has to have low power usage, and it has to be cheap because nobody in this hobby wants to spend $500 on a video transmitter that they smash into the ground the first time their quadcopter crashes. And then people say, it's so easy. Why doesn't anyone do it? And I'm like, you really haven't thought this through.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
well, we're in contact with a lot of people that are working very aggressively on this. We right now, as of today, we don't have anything that's really would satisfy our customers.
Okay, now let's reward all the people who watched the entire video. How long till we get how long? Give me a come on.
I don't
2
know.
years.
I really don't know.
3 years.
I really, yeah.
5 years. No.
I'd be hard to guess.
Trying to put you on the spot. All right.
Yeah.
All right, John. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm really thankful for the opportunity to get to pick your brain and talk to one of the guys, in some sense, who just invented the technology that we all take totally for granted. So, you guys, when you go out and fly, if you're at Flight Fest or some other event and there's 100 planes in the air and you're all having fun, think of this guy and Horizon Hobby and Spektrum, because without them, we probably wouldn't be doing this stuff. So.
Well, I appreciate it. Hey, also, anytime you guys have any, I mean, we've got a group of people here that are extraordinarily experienced, as you met when you were here, in almost every category. And our folks would be more than happy to have meetings like this with you, and happy to do so.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Good.
All right. Happy flying, everybody. We're going to get out of here.